Okay, it is 6:30, so we'll get started. This is going to be a very little business to do with our committee tonight. All the subcommittees have already presented their findings to the consultants, and we have a guest speaker here, an expert that is going to help guide our way to the finish line. Before we do that, there's a couple of things I wanted to go over. I got an email from Denise Eaton, and I'm reading it just to put it into the minutes. And it says, I am writing this in regards to my job as parking enforcement officer. My concerns are the questions of keeping parking enforcement with the police department. From what I've been told, the committee is looking to have a police officer do parking and school traffic. I have been doing this job for 13 years, and it's not just the job of chalking tires. There's many more links to this job. Yes, I do go out every 2 hours and mark. Then after the given time, a person is ticketed. It does not end there. I then have to run the data for each ticket through New York State DMV. After that, they are all entered into our system. After 30 days, final notices are sent to non-paid ticket holders. When a person doesn't respond by the date given on the notice, I then try calling. As you all know, last year I brought in $22,905. Other tickets are lapse inspections. As for school traffic, that is a very crazy time. There are times that I am up there alone because there is only one officer on and they may be called on a job. My hours are 7:30 to 3:30, but I am up at the school by 7:20 because the kids usually come early. That area cannot be left unattended at any time. Parents are dropping kids off, buses are coming in, and kids are running across the street. I even come in just to do school traffic if I have to get off. Because if they get so crazy up there, the officer might be on another job. My other job duties is running the front desk and telling the police clerk is off or sick due to the fact that the front desk is very busy all the time. I feel also as a business owner there needs to be parking control downtown because it can get out of hand at certain times. Thank you, Denise Eaton, Parking Enforcement Officer. Since we're all done with the subcommittee report for public, that'll just be put in the minutes, and that'll be something for the town board to decide if it comes to that. Next.
I've got just a question. I don't remember seeing $22,000 in the revenue.
I thought it was $12 myself.
But we can look at it later.
All right, the second thing is I wanted, oh, right, I just read a letter from Denise detailing the job she does and that she feels that it's important to keep a parking enforcement officer on the job. And I can give you a copy of that. Or it'll be in the minutes. The other thing is I just want to say, since we're getting to the end, I feel that it's just appropriate to thank the two young ladies from MRV that have been so helpful along the way. Diane and Connie have both done a great job. They've been available whenever we needed them. They've steered us in a direction and gave us questions and questionnaires so that we didn't have to start from scratch and come up with these ideas on our own. And if it wasn't for them, I'm sure that this process would have taken much longer than it's turned out to be. Considering we've only really been meeting for 4 months, I think we've accomplished an awful lot. All the subcommittees have reported, we made all our recommendations, and now it's up to the consultants to do the financial end, come up with the tax ramifications, and I just wanted to say as committee chairman that I really appreciate all that you've done for us. And third, we turn the meeting over to Mr. Hattery. Corinne, I guess you've been meeting with the comptroller, or you have not received all
I
of
haven't gotten much information from the questions that we submitted to them.
Now, the questions that you submitted, they'll have an effect on the final cost of dissolution. All right. So we really can't get a final answer on dissolution cost until
With those questions.
those questions. But you are coming along with the cost of
Right.
employee, full-time, part-time employees, consolidation,
Right.
those figures as far as maybe the tax ramifications. Can you come up with that without the
There are
answers
actually
from comptroller?
several pieces of information that really need to be plugged in before we can start talking about tax implications. But now what we're doing is, plugging in what we do know from the recommendations that you folks have provided, plugging in those figures so that we can begin that process. God bless.
Would be punishment.
You're moving in rough shape the last few months.
Does that mean we're going to go?
Yeah, okay. Wait about an hour. It's 87, unless that's cooling down, we'll get something. So, is there anything else that any of the committee members want to bring up before I turn the meeting over to Mr. Henry? Okay, at this time, you want to introduce?
No, one of the things that I would like to do, we can actually wait until afterwards. I just would like to quickly run down the plan requirements under General Municipal Law 17A, and because that'll kind of recap those items that need to be included. Many of which, we're pulling the information together, but there are still several steps that are going to be required and are going to require that Connie and I continue to have active discussion with subcommittee members and with the full committee as we plug in the rest of the remaining information. I can wait and talk about this afterwards, or?
Well, what I was saying is that if you have a drive in front of you, I'd rather let you be able to speak and take off, and then we can finish the meeting after you.
That's very nice, yeah.
So if you're ready to go.
Okay.
Sure. Well, my understanding is that in addition to, I have just a brief handout here to give you some of the script line. I want to talk for a few minutes, and if you got questions, we can go from there. As well as coming up with a dissolution plan, the charge and the grant plan is to says alternatives, or at least one alternative. And so I think the value of that, let me make a pitch for the value of that, when you're in a position like you are, and like your citizens in the village and the town are in. Sometimes one of the best ways to understand the precise, as precise as you can make it, outcomes of a dissolution, is to have at least one alternative that say, here's one alternative to dissolution. And so that it provides a very good way for it to, just having a comparison often helps you understand exactly what the impact and the implications of dissolution are going to be in your plan. The other thing is I think it helps tease out how those other arrangements would impact citizens. For example, how's it going to impact service delivery, both kinds of services that are going to be provided under dissolution and an alternative, the cost of those services, and how citizens are going to be able to access and participate under dissolution versus an alternative. So what I have provided for you here is something that has way more alternatives than anybody ought to consider, but it's a little project I worked on. And this was in the context of being for the many of you may familiar with the village of North Warnell. They've looked at this at least 3 times over about 30 years, I think 30 or 40 years. And in this case, they just wanted to look at what all the available options were to them and the cost of those out. And so at least one of them, obviously in your report out, in your dissolution plan, you compare how dissolution compares with how things are currently for the village and the town. Another option would be, as I have listed here, about 4 or 5. Merger was equivalent to what the current statute is for consolidation. At that time, there wasn't a consolidation statute. And then there were some options for contracting with the city of Hornell, which is relatively close to enhance, which would not involve dissolution, but just a way to save money through additional contracting. And as I've gone through, Connie has shared with me your kind of service by service plans. There are a number of options and activities that you've proposed that could happen either with dissolution or without. There's some things that would only could happen or would only change with dissolution. And there's some other things that, whenever you get a group of people together and look in an in-depth way at 2 municipalities' activities, you find things that could change. Some of those things could have been changed with or without dissolution. So one of the ways that you could provide at least one alternative in your report out on the dissolution plan is to look at those items as kind of one track and say, here's a set of items that could change and what their cost and revenue impacts would be if there wasn't a dissolution. It's just a way of providing one more alternative, and it provides a way to provide a little bit more insight from all the work you've done, because you've done a lot of work, and this by providing at least one alternative, which is called for, just perusing your work as it's reported by a service area. That seems like one possible option you could pursue to provide an alternative in your dissolution plan. So, for example, there are costs that can only be achieved for dissolution. For example, on the administrative report, you discussed the cost of eliminating the village board and the costs associated with board activities. So those are costs that could only be achieved through dissolution. In your assessment of court activities, there's some activities there. There are a lot of villages that have eliminated or dissolved their court without dissolving the village. So in an alternative that was everything but dissolution, you could say, well, here's what the impact would be both on costs and revenues, because there would be a revenue impact there. That would be a little bit different on the joint costs under village dissolution in a single court. So those are a couple of examples, but I think that my understanding is you need to provide at least one alternative, and I think looking at what the cost savings you could achieve and what revenue differences there would be with some of the changes you propose that don't really require dissolution would be a nice counterpoint to the financial impacts due to dissolution. So.
Well, with most of our subcommittees, you mentioned courts. We've already said how that could dissolve the village courts and become part of the county. Such area, 2 county judges, and we could do it with one of them. The code enforcement, we already discussed that, how we could, it's already a shared service.
Right.
Now, the police department, there's really not much they can do unless the village took our recommendations to heart and changed the police department anyway. Of course, that has to do with negotiations, which sometimes easier said than done.
Sure.
But I think we've pretty much, even in the town public works and the highway department, we discussed how we could share services there, even without a dissolution. So I think are there any places where you think we need to expand what we've said in our subcommittee reports?
I was just going to ask Dr. Harry if you could talk a little bit about coterminous option that was discussed in this particular case, and it's one of the reasons why it hasn't been a real topic of discussion as an alternative so far. Is I think, well, first of all, in terms of process, we wanted to analyze services, and that's really the stage that we've just completed is looking at what post-dissolution services might look like, and now starting to understand the financial implications. But in terms of this committee would have to determine what makes sense to propose in terms of alternatives, and to what degree do you determine the feasibility, I guess, of an alternative, whether or not it's worth taking the time to pursue it, research it. I guess I just wondered what was the discussion like in terms of that option? Was it a viable option there? And
well, I mean, I think I may not have made this clear at the outset, but I think this was a village board taking the initiative to say we want to look at a range of alternatives. They weren't positioned like you are, being a committee where there's already been a vote for dissolution, and now you're charged with a dissolution plan. So I think looking at something like coterminous, which is rare. There's only 5 coterminous town voters in the state.
Excuse me, could you
explain
coterminous?
That's what I'm saying. I think it's like a little bit of just sowing some confusion in the mix, but what it is there are 5 municipalities in the state that have where in one, I haven't studied the history of all of them, but the law permits for a village to apply for coterminous town village status, or for the village to go through a process of initiating referenda to apply to have the full extent of the town outside village area declared coterminous, and so there's one coterminous town village government. There's a couple of ways to achieve it, but it's a rare thing.
So is that an annexation?
Basically.
It would be like
so
an
the village
annexation.
would annex the town, so there'd still be one
Right.
government?
But it requires, several referenda, including people that live in the town outside the village area.
So in other words, it's just a reversal of what we're doing, where we're going to dissolve the village. If it was coterminous, basically you're dissolving the town because the village would take over all the towns.
Yeah, except it's not that simple because the town, for those that still have a coterminous entity, there's still like a shadow town board there or a shadow village board.
Why is this an option all of a sudden?
I'm not introducing it.
I
I'm
guess
not introducing
what
it.
I was asking
She was
Dr.
asking me
Harry,
about it.
I asked Dr. Harry about it because if someone raises the question that that's an alternative that we didn't look at, I guess what I was asking was, is it reasonable to dismiss an option in a preliminary stage because it doesn't seem feasible, and because I want to make sure that it's not raised as an issue later. That's an alternative to dissolution. Why didn't you consider it?
And I said I use this as an example to show how to portray costs and impacts across a set of options. I didn't say it wasn't at all implying that you ought to look at this or that in your report you ought to look at this. What I was saying, based on having reviewed your reports, is that an alternative that looked at those kind of things that have been proposed as cost savings and service changes that could be achieved without dissolution would be a reasonable alternative to propose instead of next to the dissolution plan.
Yeah, I want the committee to remember that we're going to be going through a public hearing. Yeah. And when we sit in front of the people at a public hearing, we have no idea what they're going to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for us to bring out every option available so that we're aware of it. So if somebody does ask, why didn't you think of this? We can say, well, we did and we dismissed it. So I think that's why we're discussing it. Mr. Henry's not here to make recommendations. He hasn't really even discussed our own personal committee recommendations. He's just here to let us know what is available for other options. So,
He's been through this discussion, you know, we're for some of us,
Do we have time to talk about the hearing?
well, you want to do, are you familiar with the hearing, or do you want,
Process?
do you want Connie and Diane to discuss it, or have you been involved in hearings, public hearings, during a dissolution process?
Not during this, there's been a lot of change, so yeah. I think Connie and Diane have more experience with that than I do. So
So-
we have to just sit down.
Oh, okay.
It's quite fun.
So, any other questions? For Mr. Hatter?
if there's any other thoughts.
Okay, came all the way down here, we wanted to make sure we get full use of your, I think your brain.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, you know, one of the things that I've included in most of, this is an example of the communities I've worked with. And I think it's important that in the report on dissolution, they make it very clear what your changes in services are going to be, as well as what the cost of changes are going to be. I think that's, and I think also inherent in that is what kind of impact it's going to have on citizen access to local government.
We really haven't talked much about that, in all honesty.
Because it's just one of those things that people weigh, and I think this community has already weighed in on that to some extent, about and bring to the point where they have voted to have a dissolution plan. So they've weighed in on that, but you know, in your report, you know, making it clear to them what those kind of impacts are going to be is valuable. So, for example, in the community that with these options I've laid out here, one of them was annexation to the city of Cornell. And, you know, they citizens then would have gone from being, you know, having pretty much direct access to municipal officials and in terms of determining service delivery, most of which was already purchased by contract with other municipalities, to being one ward among 8 or 9 wards in a larger city. I mean, I think, you know, this community's already weighed in on that issue and how they feel about those governance issues. I think it's important to at least to lay that out to some degree in your dissolution plan, kind of the impact it's going to be on citizens.
It just means that the town board will have more responsibilities and bigger decisions to make than they currently do, because the village takes care of a lot of them. For the large majority of the people in the township live in the village. So, means the town supervisor will have more phone calls.
Another alternative, we didn't look at, as an alternative, we haven't discussed seeking small city status for the village either. The benefit of which would be to be able to preempt sales tax. But to what degree is sales tax shared? Is it a substantial source of revenue? I can't remember off the top of my head whether there's
About 100,000.
okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, so to actually do an evaluation of what additional revenue might be generated if you could preempt the sales tax, but it requires, you know, submission to the legislature. It's, you know, there's been commentary before about the unlikelihood of that being approved by the legislature in the context of
Village of Newark tried that about 15 years ago. A combination of the town and village, school district was on board, all the entities were on board. Went through the legislature, both houses, and was vetoed by the governor.
okay.
I think the last one that approved was in the 30s.
19.
Did they approve?
Yeah. I mean, it's like,
And Governor Cohen used to first
And
ordinance.
I would think it would be even a less tolerant climate now to considering.
Particularly because it means changes in state aid and that sort of thing. It's kind of going against the grain of both the governor's initiative and I think the legislature's gone along with it. So anything that would require them to approve keeping as many governments and giving them more aid would probably not be less smiled upon than in the past.
So again, not that we think it's a discussion that should be had, but rather just to kind of get on the table the fact that we didn't recommend looking at it because we didn't think it was feasible and implementable, and otherwise would have been kind of a waste of our time to pursue. But to acknowledge that it's an alternative, but one that the committee didn't support pursuing, I think is would probably be a good thing.
Yeah, particularly since there have been a number of other studies like this, not necessarily for the Dissolution Committee, that have proposed looking at city status. And be good to say, well, here's why we don't think it's a good option.
So, thank you very much. Now, your question for Diana Cottingham?
My question was the format for the hearings.
Public hearing.
I
The hearing
assume that-
themselves, or are you kind of in the context of what's left to be done in
What goes
process?
on at the public hearing? I mean, when questions are asked, do you answer them?
Oh, well, okay. My understanding of the spirit of the public hearing is to educate the public and then give them an opportunity to comment on.
So the first one would be informational.
So there's typically an informational piece, even though the information is available prior to. And in this case, there's actually a pretty stringent requirement for the meat of the plan to be published for 4 consecutive weeks. Am I quoting it right? The general municipal law says 4 consecutive weeks of it being published, and I think in the newspaper of record, which is going to be an interesting undertaking when the time comes. But then, so the public's going to have a chance to have been exposed to it, but there still should be a public presentation just to clarify the information, and followed by a public comment period so that people have a chance to be heard when they have
Is it a
thoughts to
comment or
share.
a question and answer?
I think that as a committee, you could largely determine what you want the format to be. I think you meet the requirements of a public hearing as long as it's a formal proceeding and the public has an opportunity to comment. And the comments are collected and reviewed by this committee. So I think you really could determine how you want it to be organized.
Okay. So,
I mean,
say
typically
a question comes up that we missed. We did. I mean, what do we say? Well, that's a good question. We'll give you the answer. We haven't looked at it.
I mean, if you don't have an answer, to me, that
For
you definitely
Okay.
want to make sure that you give them the information.
sure.
I think in the interest of what this committee desires to do, but I think the spirit of the public hearing is really for you to get feedback
Yeah.
on the plan as it's drafted, so that you can choose whether the feedback you're getting warrants revision of the plan.
Okay.
I think that's really the spirit of it.
But we give it to the village, our plan to the village, they accept it, then it's published, and then we have the public hearing. So,
Well, actually,
Or is that not
they
the
will
order?
not have approved the final. There should be a public hearing prior to the final approval of the plan by the village board.
Final approval, because then in the village also.
but
would have-
the village does accept our report as we turn it in. If they accept the report, then it goes to be published, then we have the public hearing. And after the public hearing, depending on how the village board sees the discussion during the public hearing, they'll either say, well, we feel that all the concerns have been met and we're going to go ahead with what we have, or they're going to send it back to the committee at that point.
I think you raised an important point, which is, and again, there's not a whole lot of precedent for this. So to some degree, Connie's experience and my experience comes from a situation where, there was no precedent, and we made things up as we went along as we felt we were meeting the requirements and meeting our obligation to taxpayers. The village board may, upon receipt of your draft, decide that the committee's work at that point is done. I know in our case, the committee was quite anxious for their work to be done because it had been a very harrowing experience, and it had extended for 1.5 years. And it was a lot of time. The time requirement was amazing. So I think, the village received the draft report and at that point dispensed the committee because the committee was ready to be dispensed. So, so revisions, if there were any, would have been the undertaking of the village board. That could be it's really the village board who's charged you, and the question really hasn't arisen yet whether or not the board would find the committee's work completed at the point of the draft, or whether the committee would. So my former answer about you participating in the public hearing piece. I know even though our committee's work was done, the committee still was there to answer questions at our public hearing. So I think that would be.
Should the public hearing just be run like any other village public hearing? You have to put it in the paper for so long. You said 4 weeks. After the 4 weeks, you have the public hearing. There's no way that the village board should be there sitting answering any questions when we're the ones that made all the decisions and recommendations. They may run the meeting because they have to, because it's a village official meeting, but they should have the support of us there as a avenue of answers. There's no way that we shouldn't be there.
Yep. I guess what I'm saying is that's something that can be determined through a discussion
the
between the
stipulation should
committee
be
and
all the same as the village law is for village hearings, public hearings.
So thanks.
But it's up to the village board.
One of the questions last night of our village board meeting was if when it's submitted, if when the plan is submitted, if there is something that the village board may disagree with or would like changed or amended or something, what would be the process to send it back to committee? Is that the process, send it back to committee, or the village board itself make changes in the actual plan and then go through the process of perhaps having to go public hearing again?
I think that's a determination that the village board would have to make. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Feel comfortable to make the changes, or if you want to send it back to the committee, I believe it's a village board. It's your plan.
Right.
What I would recommend is that when we turn in the plan and it's reviewed by the village board, I think you should have a meeting with the whole committee. So if there are questions, each subcommittee pretty much knows why they put their recommendations down. So I think it's only fair, instead of making changes, since, we discussed this before, you're the only village board member that's attended meetings. So for the rest of the village board to try to make a decision on what our submission is, really isn't fair to change anything without asking us
And I'm
first.
wondering, do we have to go through the public hearing process before there would be recommendations for changes? Because there's a 5-day period in there once the actual plan is submitted to the village board. Then
One day I drag everything in.
I know,
I
me
know
too.
my back, so I try not to carry anything.
But somewhere in there, it seems like once the plan is submitted to the village board, then there's so many days, and I don't know why 5 days sticks in my mind.
You mean initially submitted there?
When
Initially submitted?
the final plan is submitted from this committee to the village board, then they have a certain number of days to review it and then have the public hearing.
I think the stipulation was setting a date for a public hearing. It might have been that period of time. As far as answering your question, I think that the most important thing is that that the plan not be revised between the time that it's published for public review and the time that the public hearing.
So you
takes
couldn't
place.
make, the board itself could say, well, we don't make that, so let's revise it. It has to go through the process first.
I believe that would be true,
Well,
because the
we'll double
document
check.
that's been reviewed by the public should be the document that they make public comment
And I
on.
don't think that has.
I don't have it with me, but it would seem that if they submitted it to you and you felt there was something that was drastically wrong or something that you wanted changed prior to the public hearing or prior to that plan
Well, they
being
have to
put
accept
out
it prior to a public hearing being set.
by
right?
them.
No, I'm saying the village board will have to accept it, so if initially they review it and find that it's insufficient in some way, they could, I believe they could remand it
Okay.
to the committee, and, because at that point, they haven't really accepted it as
I was
complete.
thinking the mayor was saying that once they get it, then they can't send it back for changes, but they can.
Yeah, I think if they haven't formally accepted it from the committee at that point, they probably have the ability to do that. But again, we'll look into it, and
Okay.
we'll make sure we get a clear answer.
So when MRV gives us the final plan, taking all this in,
Your plan.
Yes,
because-
yes, but I mean, you're-
Yeah.
when you write up the plan, do you take each one and you say, okay, this is what it's costing, this is what we could be saving, there's no change here, the service will be the same, with the same amount? I mean, are you comparing everything that, all the information we gave you?
The vision that I have at this point for the way the information might be presented in the plan would be perhaps a narrative that explains what the service delivery
Okay.
looks like. But then in almost a similar fashion to Dr. Henry's chart, a comparison of what present services cost for, in terms of tax rate, in terms of, the cost of government services. And then maybe next to that, in the same chart, this is what it would cost with the dissolution plan as presented. And keep in mind that there will be several columns in terms of what it will cost, because it will cost former village residents one thing, and potentially cost residents of the town outside of the village another. There might be a different impact for them, likely will be. A different impact if there are separate districts. So there would be multiple columns in terms of impacts, because there are different groups of people that are impacted in different ways.
Okay.
So, we would, in the clearest way we possibly can, spell it out in a chart so that someone can see, this is the before cost, this is the after cost, after dissolution cost, in terms of tax rate, and in terms of, based on what we've been charged with, the per capita cost, and I believe, some estimates of, what the average property taxpayer might, how they might be impacted financially, speaking in terms of averages, average assessment, average tax.
After, like, 5 years, we've discussed 5 years down the road, some of the costs will disappear. So would that be in one of the charts or one of the?
No. It is, the budget sheet shows this is what the village budget is, this is what the town budget is. And as Diana was saying, each one of your sub-reports we're taking and we're plugging in. For example, if you eliminated a clerk, we would put that in the elimination column. And then what is the actual cost as it looks post-dissolution, and then any comments. If it's moving to a district, we'll put that. But that final, all of that is used as the springboard for what the proposed tax is going to be for former village residents, town outside the village, what each of those tax impacts, and then as Diana said, for maybe an average household or whatever the average assessment is. But it's going to be for that after dissolution. It's not going to go out 5 years or 4 years.
Where do the impact cost? For instance, the impact of perhaps paying employees vacation, personal, etc.
That is a separate, that is the cost of dissolution?
Which will be attorney's fees.
It's
which
going to
will
be a separate one-time cost.
And that'll be
Right. You
included.
can't put it in that budget analysis because that's what we're determining is what post-dissolution is going to look like based on what all of your recommendations were. But then there's the one-time, as Diana had mentioned, that one-time dissolution cost. Any of the renovations, you're putting organizations together, or you're going to need new phones, or whatever is involved, but it's a one-time cost.
Yeah, different
Transition
one-time
costs.
versus, yeah,
Transition.
yeah.
Does that make sense, Steve?
Basically, it's the same thing. But we had talked about eventually down the road, those one-time costs are going to disappear, maybe not in the first year or the second year. So it's basically the same thing.
Diana, did you say? You were right, they, it was 5 days after you accept the plan. It has to
After the
be,
proposed dissolution plan is endorsed by the local governing board, the following procedures apply. No later than 5 days, the plan must be
published.
here we go, displayed and made readily available in a public place within the entity, along with a summary of the plan. The proposed dissolution plan and summary must also be posted on a website maintained by the entity or by the village, town, or county in which the entity is located. The governing body must arrange for publication of the summary of the proposed dissolution plan in a newspaper of general circulation within the entity at least once each week for 4 successive weeks. And where the dissolution of the village is proposed, the governing body of the village must cause the proposed dissolution plan to be mailed to the supervisor of the town or the towns in which the village is located. That part's probably the easiest one. And then as part of the dissolution plan, the governing body must set a time and place for one or more public hearings on the proposed plan. The hearing or hearings must be held 35 to 90 days after adoption of the resolution endorsing the proposed plan. So, and it goes on to, we'll get you a copy of, in fact, I think I do
It's
have
in
this
the
in the
book.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we were discussing it, we thought, the day that you accepted it, you could go out 35 days to set up the public hearing, because that would give you 4 weeks, 28 days to have it published and to get this going as quickly as possible, so that we don't forget what we're recommending. Speaking for myself, the older you get, the easier things are to do.
I've noticed.
So, anyway. So, any other questions? Comments? The thought is that there's really nothing to be discussed next week. We thought it would be good for it to give Connie and Diane 2 weeks to work on the figures that they have, and to meet 2 weeks from tomorrow, same place, 6:30, and we'll just get an update on where they are, and we'll see if the comptroller, the state controller, can come back with
I'm going to give them a call.
some answers, because, you know, we're being criticized for not getting this done, but it's a process, and if you don't do the process properly, you're not going to get proper results. And if the comptroller doesn't get back to us in a timely fashion, there's really nothing we can do about that. So,
One thing I will be, I've already started to contact some of you as we're going through this fiscal analysis. Some questions have been generated. I know the mayor's been real quick to get back with me on some. So I will be, as I'm going through each subcommittee's report and plugging those numbers in, if I need clarification, I'll just either pick up the phone and call or email you so that I want to make sure that what we're putting down is exactly what you meant. Okay?
good idea. We don't want any gray areas. So, any other comments, questions? If not, nice short meeting. We're all done.